Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, a week ago, we started detail on Masjid Aqsa, on the details of Palestine. So the point that we got to was the aftermath of the 6-day war. As you can see on the picture on the right, Israeli soldiers arrived at the Masjid Aqsa complex on June the 7th, 1967. So the Islamic world was ruled by the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. The final caliph, the final Khalifa was Sultan Abdul Hamid Rahmatullahi alayhi II. And he was forced into exile when the Ottoman Empire was destabilized. So the 6-day war, the defeat of the Arabs allowed Israel to occupy the West Bank, Gaza, areas of Syria and Egypt, and the rest of Palestine. This also included the annexation of East Jerusalem. So after 780 years of Muslim control, again, I was speaking about the Ottoman Empire, Masjid al-Aqsa was now in Jewish hands. Until today, Masjid al-Aqsa is still occupied in Palestine. So the name that's given is Israel. But the West Bank and Gaza, even though it's known as Palestine, but yes, it is still occupied by the Jews. World leaders have come to a suggestion that they distribute the country into 2 states, but that has not yet come about. May Allah Ta'ala make it easy for everybody. Up to 350,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes and forced into refugee camps. If you look at this image here, in 1967, this is when Israel occupies Gaza and the West Bank. So currently, the area that's shaded in blue is known as Israel, and the area that is shaded in green is known as Gaza, and the West Bank, which is Palestine. Now, Israel, they also claimed territory on the Syrian part of the Golan Heights, but that I think that dispute was then closed down, and now that is a part of Syria. And also this part over here beneath Gaza, known as the Sinai Peninsula, this was also claimed by Israel, but that dispute is now over, and now it's a part of Egypt. So that was Egyptian and Syrian land occupied by Israel, but this area, which is known as the Sinai Peninsula, is no longer occupied by Israel. During the June 1967 war, Israel occupied all of historic Palestine, expelled a further 300,000 Palestinians from their homes. If we look at this image over here, we see that how over time Israel has occupied Palestine. So we would say in the first picture on the left, Palestine in 1946 was the whole of Palestine basically, and there were some areas where Jews were given refuge. And then the UN made a partition plan in 1947 where Jews were given a state, and these are Palestinian lands. Then in 1967, after the war, this area on the right became the West Bank, and this is Gaza. And now if we look at Palestine, even though the West Bank and Gaza is a part of Palestine, but all these areas have been occupied by Jews. and settlements are continuing to grow throughout Palestine. So the green shaded area that represents the green shaded area represents Palestinian land, and the white area represents Zionist land. So what we've got to understand here is that the Jews, there are many Jews on this planet who oppose the creation of Israel. You will find Jews in America, you'll find Jews in the UK as well who oppose the idea of Israel, because Israel was not ought to be the land of the Jews. This was land where Jews took refuge, and Palestinians, they assisted them, and they took them as refugees and helped them with their problems while they were residing in this land. So Zionism is actually, it's an ideology, and it's got nothing much to do with Judaism. The only reason why Zionists they portray themselves as Jews is because of anti-Semitism, and being an anti-Semite is against the law. So that would basically protect them under the anti-Semitism law. Hence, they declare themselves as Jews so that they are protected under the law. So let's have a look at the timeline from the building of the Kaaba to the current day. So the Kaaba was first of all built, which is the first masjid on earth. Then 40 years later, Masjid Aqsa was constructed, and that's in a hadith which I'll come to in a bit. In the year 570, the Prophet ﷺ was born. In the year 621, the Prophet ﷺ, he was taken to the heavens. First, he was taken to Palestine, and then from Palestine, he was taken to the heavens, known as the Isra and the Mi'raj. And that is where the Prophet ﷺ led all 124,000 prophets in Salah. And that's the only place on earth and the only time where all prophets have gathered together. In the year 622, the Hijrah took place, where the Prophet ﷺ migrated from Makkah al-Mukarramah to Madinatul Munawwarah. In the year 632, the Prophet ﷺ passes away. In the year 638, which I've discussed in detail in the last presentation, Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he conquers Palestine, and he constructs, which today is known as the Masjid al-Qibali. And I've already mentioned that Masjid Aqsa is not just a masjid, it's the whole compound, and it's the whole kind of rectangle shape, which has many it has many historical buildings, including the Masjid al-Qibali. In 691, the Khalifa Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, he builds the Dome of the Rock. That's basically 53 years later. So the Dome of the Rock didn't even exist. The kind of the building which has golden dome. So Muslims ruled for approximately 456 years. In the year 1093, the Crusades took place. Christians take over Masjid al-Aqsa. They take over the Holy Land, and they rule for only 93 years. Then in the year 1187, the student of Nuruddin Zangi rahmatullah alayh, known as Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, who was Kurdish, Salahuddin al-Ayyubi rahmatullah alayh, he then conquers Jerusalem, and it comes back into Muslim hands. Muslims control, and they have power, and they have authority over Jerusalem for approximately 761 years, and they control it until 1948. And 1948 is the year where Palestine actually becomes occupied by the Zionists. In 1885, Zionism was created. In 1914 to 1918, World War I took place, and 1922 is when the end of the Ottoman Empire, the Khilafah, took place, and the last ruler was Sultan Abdul Hamid Rahmatullah Alayh. And I also mentioned that the Ottoman Empire was ended by mostly Muslim rulers. Muslim rulers were informed by the British and the French that if they were to assist in ending the Ottoman Empire, then they would be given certain parts of Arab land, which again, they did not fulfill their promise. Despite that, I think Saudi Arabia was created in and amongst those that dispute. So in 1932, for the same reason, Saudi was created. 1939 to 1945, the Second World War took place. And in 1917, the Balfour Declaration. So Lord Balfour was the person who actually declared Israel, which is Palestine as the Jewish homeland. So Jews were basically expelled from 79 countries, mostly in Europe. This is what after Hitler, he expelled Jews from Germany. He massacred the Jews, and Jews basically were looking for shelter. And in and amongst many of the countries, Palestine took Jews as refugees. But unfortunately, Zionism took over, and they started to occupy places in Palestine, in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Jerusalem. So Arab lands have always been a safe haven for Jews. It's very unfortunate that such events have taken place. In 1922, Jewish homeland approved by the League of Nations, Europe, I've explained that as well. 1947, UN adopts new borders. Palestine rejects Israel is created. And I showed you the picture on the previous slide. If we go back, here we are. So that was the UN partition. The second picture on the left, the UN partition, which Palestine did reject. In 1967, Israel occupies most of Palestine, including Gaza and the West Bank. The actual Arabic word is Gaza, and Gaza it's the actual home place and the birthplace of Imam Shafi Rahmatullah. In 1987, the first Muslim uprising takes place. In the year 2000, the second Muslim uprising takes place. And there's war between Israel and Palestine. And if you look at this sequence here, year 2008, 2012, 2014, 2018, 2019, nearly every kind of sequenced year, Israel then attacks Gaza. And again, as we've seen recently in Ramzan, in the year 2021, Israel attacks Masjid Aqsa and also attacks Gaza. What we've got to understand here is that those people who say there's a conflict between Israel and Gaza, the word conflict is just not the right word to use. The reason being is because a conflict takes place where both sides are equal. Israel and Gaza, there is no equality, there's no comparison. Israel has one of the best militaries throughout the world. In some circumstances, it is better than the military of America. And all you see in Palestinian hands is maybe rocks and stones. Even Gaza, one of the most condensed areas in the whole world, a massive population where they have a condensed area, they hardly have any ammunition. So the fact that Israel calls it a conflict, the BBC calls it a conflict, is totally unacceptable. Anyway, I saw the presentation last week and I've kind of finished it off this week. I hope this has given you a good insight of what the reality is between the conflict between Israel and Gaza. Now, even though I think recently it's calmed down in a sense, but the reality is that Israel has always occupied Gaza. Gaza and Palestine, there'll always be a struggle. And if media shuts down, if media doesn't talk about Palestine and Israel, it doesn't mean that it's all calmed down. The reality is that it's still happening, and we should try our utmost best to assist Palestinians in need. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you some ahadith regarding the virtues of Masjid Aqsa. Just a minute. Okay. So the first hadith, and if you guys have any questions, you can use the chat function. The first hadith is regarding Masjid Aqsa. That Masjid Aqsa was built 40 years after the Kaaba Sharif, Masjid al-Haram. So there's a 40-year distance, and this again shows the significance of Masjid Aqsa. Basically, these ahadith and these hadith are to give us an insight and raise awareness of the virtues of Masjid Aqsa. Why is it an important place to Muslims? The next hadith states, Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala anhu narrates that the Prophet ﷺ said, you should not undertake a special journey to visit any place other than the following 3 masajid. Now, this does not mean that a person cannot travel anywhere apart from Masjid Aqsa, Masjid Nabawi in Medina, and Masjid al-Haram in Makkah. What it basically means that if there was anywhere worth traveling, then it would be to these 3 places on earth, which are the three places, the 3 holiest places in Islam: Masjid al-Haram, Masjid al-Aqsa, and Masjid Nabawi. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Another hadith states that the reward of a prayer in Masjid al-Haram, so one person reads, if a person prays Salah at home, you receive 1 reward. Obviously, for women, they receive the full reward, which is 27 times. And if you pray in the masjid, then you receive the reward of 27 times. And if a person is to pray Salah with Jamaat in Masjid al-Haram in Makkah, then he would receive the reward of 100,000 Salah. For 1 Salah, the person is praying Zuhur Salah, for example, you receive the reward of 100,000 Salah. And if a person is to pray in Medina, he or she would receive the reward of 1,000 Salah. And to pray Salah in Masjid Aqsa, anywhere in the Masjid Aqsa, so in the whole boundary, the sanctuary of Masjid Aqsa, a person would receive the reward of 500 Salah. And again, that shows the reward and the significance of all 3 masajid on the face of this earth. Now, you may or may not know that the Masjid Aqsa was actually built on the order of Sulaiman alayhi salatu wassalam. Sulaiman alayhi salatu wassalam, he was a very just ruler. He was one of those prophets, one of those people on earth who was given the power of ruling the whole earth at once. And the reason the reason he had this power was manifold. He was very grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in return, he gave him this power. He had power over the jinns. He had power over the wind. He had power over many creatures. He could also speak to the animals in their own language. In the Quran Kareem, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُمْ, which means that every single animal on this earth praises Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُمْ. But the only thing is that, as human beings, we don't understand their language. And this is the kind of meaning which has been mentioned in the Quran Kareem. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Sulaiman the power of ruling the whole earth at once. He had power over the jinn and the wind. There's a narration in Tafsir Khazin, in the commentary of Khazin of the Quran Kareem, where it states that Sulaiman had so much power that once he decided that from Palestine, he traveled around the world. So he then, with his army of jinn and human beings and any animals that he had with him, he traveled on the wind, on the clouds, and he had breakfast in, I think, a breakfast in Iraq, and he had lunch in China, and then he returned to Palestine on the wind. So there was a kind of a big, massive block of wood, a massive log of wood, and that would be placed on the wind. The wind would come underneath the log, and they would kind of fly into the air. So Sulaiman he was given great power. Because of this power, Sulaiman he ordered the jinn that they build the Masjid Aqsa. Now, like I said, Masjid Aqsa is a massive compound. It's the sanctuary. It's not just the masjid itself, because the masjid was built by Hazrat Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Well, it was rebuilt and constructed by Hazrat Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And so Sulaiman he gave the order to the jinn that they build the Masjid Aqsa. So the jinn, they started building the Masjid Aqsa. Sulaiman would stand there observing and making sure that they do their job. And then in the Quran Kareem, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, to the nearest meaning, that Sulaiman actually passed away. He passed away while he was praying Salah, and he was leaning on his staff. He was leaning on his staff stick. And underneath the staff, there were ants who were chewing the wood. And bit by bit, the wood would decrease. And eventually, when the wood was all chewed up, Sulaiman collapsed because he had passed away. When the jinn saw this, it is mentioned that the jinn said that if we knew from before, we would have stopped the construction of the Masjid Aqsa way back, because the jinn, they had a lot of fear of Sulaiman ﷺ, so they didn't have the guts, they didn't have the courage to actually confront Sulaiman ﷺ. So, but it was a plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the Masjid Aqsa construction should be complete, and then Sulaiman ﷺ it would be revealed that Sulaiman ﷺ had passed away. So that was the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the kind of background of this hadith, where Sulaiman ﷺ had such a great kingdom that he made dua, he supplicated to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala about three things. So one is that he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that whatever decision he makes is in line with the Sharia, is in line with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala desires. The second dua that he made, the second supplication that he made, was that nobody is given a kingdom like Sulaiman after him, and after Sulaiman nobody ever has had a kingdom like him. And the third supplication, which is an amazing supplication, And for this reason, solely for this reason, a person should, visit Masjid Aqsa, so much reward, that whosoever prays 2 rakats inside the Masjid Aqsa, in the compound of Masjid Aqsa, and then exits from the compound of Masjid Aqsa, that person will become absolutely clean from sins like the day his mother gave birth to him. That is an absolutely amazing virtue. Just by doing 2 rakats of salah in the Masjid Aqsa, a person would be cleaned of all his sins and would be just like as his or her mother had gave birth to them. All the sins are wiped out. The next hadith states that Jabir radiallahu ta'ala relates that the Prophet was asked, who will enter paradise first? The Prophet said, the prophets. Then the Sahabi asked, that, O Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who will enter next? The Prophet then said, martyrs. See, martyrs have a very important place in Islam. Those that sacrifice their lives in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are known as literal martyrs. But there is a hadith that mentions that when the Prophet ﷺ asked this question to the Sahaba, that who is a martyr, the Sahaba they actually gave the same answer, that a person who gives his or her life in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then the Prophet ﷺ then mentioned to the this meaning, then in that case, the martyrs and the shuhada would be very less. And then the Prophet ﷺ then mentioned that that person who dies with a stomach problem is classified as a martyr. That person that drowns is classified as a martyr. That person who falls from a cliff and passes away is classified as a martyr. To the nearest meaning, that person also who dies in a sickness which is going to take his life is also classified as a martyr. So a person can gain martyrdom in many other ways other than giving their life in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So martyrdom has a very high status in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Martyrdom has a very, very high status. But there's one, see, entering paradise, prophets will enter paradise. That there's no doubt about that. Many other people have also entered paradise, but there's one thing that will stop even a martyr from entering paradise, and that is debt. So if a person has borrowed money from someone and that money has not been returned, and in and amongst those events a person passes away, and the person who is the creditor has not forgiven that person, or the person who has borrowed, the debtor, has not returned that money to the heirs, to the inheritors of his inheritors. The inheritors have not paid the money back to the creditor. Then in them circumstances, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will stop a person from entering paradise. Hence, taking a loan or borrowing money from someone should be done only at a last resort. And so we carry on in the hadith. The hadith then mentions that, O Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who next will enter paradise? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam then mentioned the callers of azan at the Kaaba. Calling the azan has immense virtue. The man then asked, who next will enter paradise? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam then answered, the callers of the azan in Masjid Aqsa. And then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam then said, the callers of the azan in the Masjid Nabawi. And then the Prophet ﷺ then mentioned, and then those people who give azan in their normal masajid will enter paradise according to their deeds. The next hadith states, Huzaifa ibn Yaman radiallahu ta'ala reports that the Prophet ﷺ said that the most superior i'tikaf is in that of the three masajid, Masjid Haram, Masjid in Medina, and the Masjid Aqsa. I mean, the virtues of i'tikaf, they can be found in many books. Hazrat Sheikh Zakaria Rahmatullah Ali actually has a book on the virtues of i'tikaf that can be looked at, where you will see many virtues regarding i'tikaf. The next hadith says, Hazrat Maimuna radiallahu ta'ala anhu relates that she said, O Messenger of Allah, inform us about visiting Masjid Aqsa. He said, it is the land of gathering and resurrection. Visit it and pray there. According to one hadith, the land of the blessed land is not just Masjid Aqsa, it's various places like in parts of Lebanon and Syria as well. So there are narrations which mention that this will be the place of gathering when Qiyamah occurs and when everybody will be called to account for their deeds. This will be a place where everybody will be then resurrected and will be called to account for their good and bad deeds. Then the hadith mentions that one salah performed there is equivalent to 1,000 salahs performed elsewhere. There's a hadith which mentions 500 salah as well. Again, I think this then depends upon a person's sincerity. But the more sincerity a person has, the more reward a person shall receive. Hazrat Maimuna radiallahu ta'ala anha, she further asked, what about the one who doesn't have the capacity to travel to Jerusalem? See the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the Prophet then replied, if a person does not have the capacity, then send some oil to be used in its lamps. As the one who sends oil to be used in its lamps will be like the one who performs salah there. And again, I would say also that a person who sends donations to help the people of Palestine, so that they can preserve, they can protect the land of Masjid Aqsa, will be given the same reward. So there's many virtues regarding Masjid Aqsa, whether you donate, whether you travel there, and many other kind of prospects. The next hadith states, says, Salama radiallahu ta'ala anha, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ relates that she heard from the Messenger of Allah ﷺ saying that if anyone enters into the state of ihram for Hajj or Umrah, from where? From Masjid Aqsa, and with the same ihram, then goes to Masjid Haram and performs Hajj or Umrah, all that person's sins will be forgiven, and on top of that, will be guaranteed paradise. Another very important virtue of Masjid Aqsa. Hazrat Zayd ibn Thabit narrates that we were with Allah's Messenger ﷺ composing transcripts of the Quran on parchments. Hazrat Zayd ibn Thabit, so they were basically gathering the parts of the Quran Kareem, where the Prophet ﷺ then said, blessed is Ash-Sham. And as I mentioned before, Sham is not only Masjid Aqsa, Sham is not only Syria, it's many parts combined together which are known as the blessed land. We asked, why is that so? The Prophet ﷺ then said, he said, because the angels of the compassionate one have spread their wings over it. So this area is a very blessed land, which includes the area of Palestine and the area of Syria as well. And as it says here, Ash-Sham today includes Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine. The next hadith mentions Abu Umama radiallahu ta'ala narrates that the Prophet ﷺ said, the chosen land of Allah is Ash-Sham. He has therein his chosen creation and servants. Most definitely a large group from our Ummah will enter paradise without having to give reckoning or experience any form of punishment from Masjid Aqsa. So from the blessed land. And many people on the day of judgment will go into paradise without any type of reckoning. The hadith mentions 70,000, but then there's more detail about further uh, further 70,000 people in paradise who will enter paradise. Hazrat Abdullah ibn Umar reports that the Prophet said, when fitna befalls, safety will be in Asham. Now, what kind of fitna, what kind of great tribulations are mentioned in this hadith? That's something that can be looked upon in the commentary of the hadith. But most probably these are tribulations which will take place before the end of time. At that time, safety will be in Sham, and that is a place where Imam Mahdi, rahmatullahi alayhi, will also arrive, and people will assist him in the war which will take place before the day of judgment. We've already mentioned that Masjid Haram, after Masjid Haram, 40 years later on, Masjid Aqsa was then built. But you may or may not know that one of the first qiblas, the first qibla was actually Masjid Aqsa. So the Prophet ﷺ did pray towards Masjid Aqsa while he was in Medina. And there's actually a masjid in Masjid Aqsa known as Masjid Qiblatain. Masjid Qiblatain is the masjid where the Sahaba, while they were praying Salah, they were given an instruction during their Salah to face towards Makkah. So for approximately 16 or 17 months, the Muslims prayed towards Masjid Aqsa. This was so that Muslims could show the Jews and the Christians that there are similarities between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, to bring them closer to Islam. But then it was the desire of the Holy Prophet ﷺ that the Qibla be changed towards Masjid Haram. And if you go into the second para, so Yaqulu Sufaha, you will see that there's detail regarding that, where the Prophet ﷺ, shows his desire that the Qibla be changed towards Masjid Aqsa. Eventually, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted the Prophet ﷺ's supplication, and the Qibla was changed towards Masjid Haram. If any of you guys have visited Medina, you will see that there's a masjid there, Masjid Qiblatain, and both sides of the Qibla are very, very obvious. Actually, I'll show you something. Just a second. So, I don't know if you guys can see this. There's a website called IslamicLandmarks.com. If you visit this website before you actually go to Masjid Aqsa, or you go to any of the Muslim blessed place, there's detail of Muslim heritage sites. So if, for example, if we go into Palestine, Masjid Aqsa, you'll see that there's detail of places to visit there. We have the Masjid Qibali, Mihrab Zakaria, Masjid Umar, we have the Mosque of the 40 Martyrs, the Dome of the Rock. So all these places can be looked at in detail with pictures regarding Masjid Aqsa, many of the places. If we go into Medina, if I can find Masjid Qiblatain, here we are. That's Masjid al-Qiblatain. That's the picture of Masjid al-Qiblatain. And if you see there inside the masjid, there's a symbol there opposite the present Qibla, which shows the direction of the original Qibla. So this is, I think this is a fantastic website which you can actually go on and have a look for yourselves. If we go back to the hadith. Okay, the next hadith states, we've already discussed that already. Okay, another very important thing is that Masjid Aqsa is also the place where Isra and Miraj took place. And I've already described that in detail as well. So on the night in which I was taken on the journey, the Prophet mentions, I saw Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. He was slim with wavy hair. He resembled the men of Shanu'a. I saw Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. He was a man of medium height with red complexion, as if he had stepped out of the bath. I am the closest of the children of Ibrahim alayhi salam in resemblance to him. Then I was brought 2 vessels, one containing milk and the other wine. He said, drink whichever one you wish. I took the milk and drank it. It was said, you have taken the fitrah. If you have taken the wine, your ummah would have erred. So these are places, and these are events that took place during the Mi'raj. Okay, today's session, I'm going to end it here. We have 5 minutes left. If you guys have any questions, please type in your questions in the chat box. Okay, and inshallah, next week we will continue with Talim al-Haq, where we will start from the project and the topic of Tahara. Erd means mistake. So if the Prophet ﷺ had taken the wine, then there would be people who have been really misled in the ummah. But the Prophet ﷺ, he took the milk, and hence the Prophet ﷺ gave complete guidance of Islam, and the Sahaba were guided by the Prophet ﷺ, who now act as evidence for us whenever we look at the hadith, and we also have the Quran Kareem. Okay, guys, so I shall meet you next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.